Hi, good morning, and welcome to the ZP FoodSense webinar. We like to do this webinar once a week, and it's really answering technical questions that come in during the week. In particular, this week we'll be addressing technical questions that come from our clients and our users of our FoodSense technology. So let me go forward a little bit faster. Just want to make sure that everything is going okay. Yeah, it's fine. Right, so let me go a little bit faster and just jump straight into this and say, okay. So this week we're going to be talking about testing chili powders, and we'll be primarily this week, the person testing chili powders is actually testing quite hot chili powders, and that will be important to some of the answers that I do give. I do want to say we do have a webinar on the, I think it's the 25th of January, and I'll put a link here. I also want to say if you're here specifically for answers to questions that you've put, give me about 5 minutes, and then 5 minutes in you'll find that we start answering the questions. But just if you're new to FoodSense and the testing of chili powders using this kind of handheld device, there is a webinar on the 25th of January. You can attend that, it's for free. The technology that I'm talking today, I mean, I'll be talking very much in, I feel like abstract. I'll be using raw data that actually comes off this instrument. But this is an instrument, it's a handheld device, has these little sensors and little cartridges, and you kind of put chili powder, suspensions of chili powders on that, and you can measure the hotness of the chili powder through the direct measurement of capsaicin. I think the hardware and the software is actually quite intuitive. The person who's asking the questions this week, they'd set up and started using the device really just on their own, so that was kind of nice. We do like to get online and give people training because we want to make sure that they're doing little nuances and things like making sure the dilutions are correct. And then one of the interesting aspects of the instrument, and this is something I'd really like to expand, so if people have got analytes or tests that are not currently on the FoodSense technology, we are able to add additional QR codes that would then allow new tests to be used. So as I say, you can find the app. So the FoodSense technology is really a meter that works with an app, and it also works with a cloud system. You can find the app on the Google Play Store, or you can also find it on the Apple App Store. Quick comment: the app is no good unless you've got the hardware. So be careful about downloading it because it's sort of pointless unless you've got the hardware. Once you've got the app, you can scan this code and it will open up the chili. Or you can scan this code and it'll load up the ginger. You can scan this code and it'll open up the total antioxidative status, which is a predictor of shelf life. So everyone gets personal online training. We do try to get people's training quickly as possible so that they have a good start. We do have weekly webinars. This is that weekly webinar. You'll see that we put a fair amount of effort into answering questions. So you'll see that in a short while. We also do have the monthly webinars as well. So as I've already indicated, we will do a webinar on the 25th of January, and that is free. So if you're watching this video now or you're watching it live, I'll put a link underneath this YouTube video at the end, and you'll be able to find that. The only reason I want to show this is because we are about to dive into raw data, and I don't want you to think that the user experience is just raw data. It's not. The user experience, I would suggest, has kind of two levels to it. We kind of have this kind of consumer experience, and I'll describe the consumer experience. And then there's a kind of advanced experience. And to be fair, the reason you have to have these two experiences is because sometimes you will have R&D scientists, research scientists, who really want to sort of understand everything and see everything. And then you'll also have production. And in production, people, people mostly don't have the time. Sometimes they don't have the training, but they basically need a result there and then to make a production decision on this is kind of real-time stuff. So I'll describe the user experience and then describe that actually there are two levels of user experience here. There's the basic and the advanced. And if you're here to see your specific questions being answered, don't worry, I will cover it in a minute. But I don't want to make people think that everything advanced that we talk about today is the first level of experience. It's not. Take your sensor, take your meter, take your app, and I've just said that those apps are available either on the iOS store or the Google Play Store. Take your Julie cloud system, put your sensor into your meter, put your sample on the sensor. Your meter is controlled by the app, and your meter will give the data back to the app, and the app will actually put the data in the cloud. but you will get the results of concentration, I should say, in SHU, Scoville heat units. You will get that concentration on your phone. Good. Now, there is almost like an advanced version of this as well, that all the raw data is actually saved. So if you're ever, so I say to you that everyone gets training, everyone gets support, you know, and we have these webinars. Now, in that comment, if we're going to support you, then obviously seeing the raw data allows us to know what's actually going on. So you don't have to, if you want to just have a basic experience, or you just think about using this in manufacturing, you don't have to listen from this onwards. The take-home message at this point is you can put a chili powder sample on there, get a result, and you're done. But this is much more of an R&D kind of person going on here. So we need to kind of have a sort of transparency on the data. So the data goes up to the cloud, and actually in this case, the really nice thing about this technology stack, you can understand how advanced this really is, that in fact he can even share the data with me. And it's not about downloading the data. He's got a clickable button in the cloud which allows him to share the data, because I'm also on the same database. So there's no kind of handing over data or anything like that. I can see in real time the data going up to the cloud. So you can have a basic experience, but here we're having a more, let's say, advanced experience as well. We also have something called API. So if somebody's got LIMS systems, these are laboratory information management systems, they can also grab the data as well. So question number 1 was about converting micromolar to SHU. I have answered this question in an email, but I will address it in more detail. The other one really is about, I'll read it, and so I can make sure I really sort of, in examining raw data, so we both have a sort of common understanding of that, which indicator should I look for to ascertain if the measurements were within an acceptable range? So I will answer that in detail. For instance, if he gets a cut-off peak, and he kind of calls that anvil, and I'll adopt that language as well, because I realise it's quite useful actually, because at ZP we happen to be electrochemists. The technology is actually based on electrochemical analysis, but not everyone, you know, and it wants to know about voltammetry. But actually, when I look at the data, we've kind of got about 3 classifications of raw data, and I will cover that. He says, should I repeat it? He asks, should he do more dilution? And the quick answer is no, but I will explain why you shouldn't be doing more dilution. Concerning outliers, I did a video previously. I'll show the video today and also link to it, where I talked about, well, look, you know, you can do statistics on your data. You can determine your average, you can determine your standard deviation, and you can also determine your relative standard deviation. So I've had that conversation, but I'm also saying that if you gather 5 sets of data and one of your sets of data is greater or less than the average plus or minus 2 standard deviations, you can legitimately reject it in the food industry, and I will describe that as well. And then the hardest question really is number 4: why do you have outliers? It's kind of makes me, I've been thinking about this for quite a while. I've been thinking about you know, you're standing on the beach and all the waves come in and everything's, you know, great, you know, and then a rogue wave comes in and sweeps everyone off the beach. It's not the answer to your question, but sometimes it does happen. Some accumulation of events happens, and you get a freak wave. Now that's not the answer, you know, that's not the answer you're looking for, but it is a hard one for me, because I think that there's so many parameters that can lead to an outlier, that it's only when events stack upon each other that you suddenly have an outlier. But I will, you know, I have a couple of slides on that at the end, but it is the hardest question for me to answer. Converting micromolar to SHU. So the first thing is, I was talking earlier on about that sort of, I don't want to say basic, but the beginner experience will just give you SHU, Scoville heat unit. So on the app here it says 78,800. In the Julie database, because all the data goes up there, we get these voltammograms. As I say, I'm not expecting people to look at this stuff, but I will look at it if I'm required to support and advise. And we are going to add I've taught the person here how to manually convert from what's called micromolar to Scoville heat units. It's just a simple coefficient, but we are going to add it into the database so that people can stop having to do that manual manipulation. But what I'm saying here is that, well, what's good about this is you can just get the answer on your phone. just know that the raw data is up in your phone and also, up in the cloud, and also know that we are saving the values as well. So that kind of gives you a traceability, and it is really good, because otherwise you're actually taking care of a file system. And when this person's done 150 tests, they can go back and find their data any time. If you had 150 tests and you were trying to control this on a C drive or a Dropbox, it can get a little bit complicated, let's say, but all their data goes to the cloud. It really takes care of that for them. So the quick answer is I've taught them how to do the coefficient or the unit change, but also we're just going to make the database do it for them as well. Question number 2 is around about in examining raw data, and they use this term anvil-shaped. So I want to say I'm going to categorize the raw signal into kind of intense. So sometimes you can have intense data, sometimes you can have dilute data, and sometimes you can have this anvil data. So I will sort of deal with these 3 categories. I should also say there's probably perfect data as well, but I haven't defined that today. But when we talk about intense, so when this particular user first got hold of the system, they were testing something that may have been in the range of 1 million Scoville heat units, but they were doing a 1 in 10 dilution. So they were really a lot of capsaicin, and the signal was intense. And by intense then, this is the raw signal that they had. By the way, the app did tell them, I think it's warned them that it was too little dilution. I realized that too little dilution sometimes is a little bit too sensitive, because they think that it hasn't worked at all, but in fact it has. But it did mention it. So they've taken a 1 million Scoville heat unit, they've powder, they've diluted it 1 in 10. It's too intense, because when we look at the raw signal goes up there. This is a flat line, and this is a flat line. What this is we only have about, on the y-axis here, I'll just drag my mouse in here, anything above 12 or anything greater than minus 12, we can't see it. So literally they've got so much capsaicin, it's outside the bounds of the instrument. So if you see that due to a massive signal, then I would classify that as intense, and you do need to dilute. Now this person today doesn't need to dilute, because their data is actually looking more like anvil. So I will describe anvil in a bit. But if you're a new user, I may advise you that your data is too intense, because I know what I'm looking for, and we will tell you to essentially dilute it. This is this particular user, and this is when they were first got the instrument. They were doing 1 in 10, no big issues. Now this is the same user, and I've described this as dilute. So what I mean by dilute is when they look at their online database, they see some data that looks like this. This is what we call the first scan. They have some data that looks like this. This is what we call the second scan. And this is what we have, which we've basically rotated the second scan, and we analyze it. What we're looking for is the peak here. Now, this is their mal powder. I do not want them to change the concentration here, because in fact, what's happening here is this is quite dilute. So if you were, and I have customers in India whose powders are approximately sort of 50,000 to 150,000 Scoville heat units. So they are there. I'm telling them to do a 1 in 100 dilution. I am telling them to do that, but I do not want this person to do that, because I want a consistency of data where everything is gathered in 1 in 1,000, because then it allows us to easily compare and not have a second parameter in our minds, which was the dilution factor. So I want them to stay, consistent. So there's sort of a big reason why I want them to stay consistent, because I want everything to be comparable, so that we can say that is a hot, that is a medium, that's a mild, and we don't have to sort of worry, well, what dilution did you use, and get into that kind of conversation. So, but if you were, as I say, I've got some customers in India where actually their powders really are just falling into the mild and medium, then I tend to get them to do 1 in 100 dilution. So the reason I describe this as dilute is, you will see that I quite like this peak to be about 5 microamps, or maybe higher. So it's quite dilute. So I would describe that as dilute. So in some circumstances, I would actually tell people to not dilute too much, but in this instance, don't. But I will sort of, let's say I'm classifying data at the moment and saying, you've got intense. Intense is just obvious. We can't deal with intense. Dilute, whether it is too dilute or not, I think it really depends on the circumstances. And that's why you can see that we like to do this kind of, personalized, support. And then we also have anvil, which is, strictly speaking, what they did call out. And so by anvil, the reason, so anvil is it's kind of cut off here. But the reason I'm not bothered by that is because that's not the peak I'm actually using. I'm actually using the peak down here, and that's looking pretty nice. So that's why anvil is acceptable to me. And the answer to your question is no, don't. You get a lot of data like this because actually you are using quite hot powders. I have, again, other people in India, as an example, where they're not actually testing such hot powders. They very rarely have anvil. But anvil's okay because, in fact, the peak that I'm looking for is down here. And this guy is, I like, I kind of have this number of 5, let's say. I quite like 5 because it gives me a nice big peak to look at. So I quite like that. So don't do anything with anvil. It's actually okay. So categorizing your raw data, when you first started, you had 1 in 10 dilutions. You had data I'd call intense. So hopefully now we can have this kind of common language that it was intense. Some of your mild data actually is a little dilute, but I don't want you to touch it honestly because you're building up a map of powders and their hotnesses, and this map is self-consistent. Everything's at 1000. It's great. But if you were in India and you were a different customer, and I thought actually you were working with really powders that were just mild and medium, I might actually have advised that, but I didn't. So don't, please. Anvil is okay, and I've explained that anvil, the cutoff that you see that gives you anvil, is not cutting off the peak that I'm really interested in. So that's why I'm actually okay with anvil. Question number 3, outlier rejection. This is slightly philosophical, but I'll give you the background to this. So this is raw data. 7 tests on a powder. Below 500, below 500, above 500,000, above 500,000, below 500,000, above 500,000. And then this is glaringly obvious one in the middle that just sort of looks really out of family. So this is 7 individual tests all done on the same sample. And I sort of I did a video about this when I actually said, all right, well, a previous video on this, I talked about how to do outlier rejection. And I sort of suggested that in the food industry, you can do outlier rejection based on anything that's above and below the average plus standard deviations, or anything below the average minus 2 standard deviations. You could really reject it. Now the reason, and in that case, we did run some scenarios and we were able to sort of argue how to reject the outlier. But I was rejecting the outlier based on this idea of plus or minus 3 standard deviations. But plus or minus 3 standard deviations is a really strict, and rightly so, depending on the application. See, if you were treating somebody for a disease, or then you really would want to be very certain on things. This is the food industry. Especially if you're doing business to consumer, margins can be very tight. So you've got to be careful about trying to apply almost like pharmaceutical grade filters on your data, because you just don't have those kind of margins to deal with that. And the outcome of getting it wrong is not so critical as when you're treating patients. So the outlier rejection is this, that in fact, all the chili data, including this particular customer, when I look at their data, they often have highs and lows, and most of it's actually in the middle. So it's what we call sort of normally distributed, or the term is normal distribution. Gaussian distribution as well is a term that's used. So most of their data, in fact, 68% of their data is actually within the average or the mean plus or minus 1 standard deviation. So they're in this part of the curve. Then they've got some data that's in a bit more of it, which is in plus or minus 2 standard deviations. And then as you sort of get out to plus or minus 3 standard deviations, practically all of their data is in there. So I'm just going to back up slightly because I want to just kind of make the point that or not average, but if your data is following a Gaussian distribution, 68% of your data is within plus or minus one standard deviation. If you're following a Gaussian distribution, 95.4% of your data is in plus or minus two standard deviations. So I quite like that, because what it means is that if I decide that I'm going to reject anything that is outside of the range of my average plus two standard deviations, anything that's outside on this tail, which is my average plus two standard deviations, I'm going to reject it. And anything that's below my average minus two standard deviations, that's down here, I'm going to reject it. For me, in the food industry, when we're talking about, you know, the hotness of a powder, it's acceptable, because your probability of getting it wrong is less than 5%. So I'm willing to accept that I might, you know, if I say, right, I'm going to reject this data because you're either above my average plus two standard deviations or you're below my average minus two standard deviations, my risk of getting it wrong is less than 5%. And to be honest, you know, it's a business decision. I think it's also common sense that you can actually accept that when you're talking about the hotness of Scoville heat units. So that's why I say in the food ingredients industry, we can accept plus or minus two standard deviations. Because in the end, you have to make these measurements. You have to be moving on. And what I find interesting about this sort of conversation is, so I want to get that average as accurately as possible. And I don't want to be dragged away from accuracy by one outlier up here. And that's why I want people to reject the data that's outside of the average plus or minus two standard deviations. And I must say that, you know, in this particular case, this person's has done well over 100 measurements, and this kind of particular outlier is a really exceptional one. So, you know, they don't occur that much, but when you do this much testing, on occasions outliers will appear. So the more testing you do, then the more, you know, then you will see these on occasions. I feel like this extreme outlier, we've seen it, you know, maybe once, twice, but that's out of over 100 measurements. So the rate of it is, you know, less than 5%. So it's kind of, you know, I would predict that your rate is less than 5%, and actually your rate is less than 5%. So plus or minus two standard deviations, because my risk of getting it wrong is less than 5%, and I can accept that. Why do we have outliers? So you have measurement errors, and the measurement errors can really come from human errors. It's not, except people don't like to hear that term, but you know, you kind of have human errors. I put in here instrument errors. Obviously at ZP, you know, we're responsible for our instruments. We think it's good, but you know, something can have happened along the way, you know, that actually that, you know, that it is an error. In this case, I think it's genuinely quite high, because I've seen the raw signal. It's not like a sort of distorted or strange signal. It's really quite high. So you can have human errors and instrument errors. So an outlier can come from measurement errors. This is a generic statement. It's not limited to FoodSense. And you can also have sampling errors, which I suspect this might be the case. That I do say it rather a lot, but capsaicin is not capsaicin. Chili powders are very heterogeneous. I know this person has done a lot of vortexing along the way, so they've tried to homogenize it. But sometimes it's like the waves on the beach. We can hit a rogue hotspot, and you've sampled it, and you've got a you know, very hot. For some reason, there was a, you know, this is just making it up. You know, there's a grain of chili powder that was giving off quite a lot of capsaicin in that local area. You came in with a pipette tip, you sucked it up. I know it sounds improbable, but at the same time, you know, you're standing on the beach and the waves are coming in, and then you see the YouTube video and the big wave came in and swept everyone off. Sometimes, you know, things stack upon one another, and you do get errors. But your rate of, let's say, outliers is actually quite low. That outlier is, you know, one in over 100 tests. So in summary, converting micromolar to Scoville heat units, I have shown you how to do it. It's literally just a coefficient. It's not linked to actual concentration. It's just a way of us going from units to units. I'll put it into Julia. We'll get it put into Julia as well. I've discussed really three kind of sets of data, where one of them is, you know, intense, where you can understand that we just can't deal with intense. It's outside of the limits of the instrument. We do have dilute, and some of your data is dilute, but actually stick with it, because there's a bigger picture here, which is you want to rank and be able to, I want you to be able to look at all of the data and know that it was all collected in the same way, so that those numbers are all consistent with one another. So don't go there with dilute. And most of your data is actually in the anvil case, but in your case with the anvil, actually the peak that I want is actually really well formed and, you know, looks nice and intense. Concerning outlier rejection, you can see that the reason I want to do average plus or minus 2 standard deviations is because your risk of, you know, you carry a kind of less than 5% risk of calling it wrong, but that risk in the context of this chili powder, and also that, you know, the more and more data you collect, the greater your sense is. You don't really have a 2 million Scoville heat unit powder there, and your risk of getting it wrong, that 2 million is real, is about 5%, is less than 5%. So I would actually, you know, accept the risk. I mean, when I think about risk being 5%, I don't really consider it that much of a risk, to be honest with you. Why do we have outliers? You can have measurement errors. That can be human beings or it can be machines. Your rate of error is really quite low, but you can also have sample error there, that you really did actually pick up. There was a grain in that solution that was extremely intense, and you sampled right next to it. And that's why we do the multiple sampling. But sometimes, you know, if you accept that outlier, it's going to drag all those results up and sort of really nullify the fact that most of your results are telling you that powder is about 445 Scoville heat units, and you can't accept that one pulling you up like that. So I want to say thank you. You can see that this webinar is part of our kind of ongoing support for. When you look at the FoodSense technology, we have the sensors, we have the meters, we have the cloud system, and also there is a sort of, you know, that element of support also wrapped around it. And this webinar, this weekly webinar, is a part of that. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. Okay, thanks very much.